Good evening. This is a talk on imperialism and empires. We have heard the word empire quite frequently after 9/11, and many people in the academic community who had hesitated to use that word, especially in the context of the US, started using it, and usually in a sense that they approved. Here I will try to give a deeper theoretical picture of why we should use the word imperialism and not just empire, and what it really means in terms of the world capitalist system. In other words, I will try to go causally more deeply into what motivates the phenomena that are associated with imperialism, and of which empire may be one manifestation, but not necessarily the only one, and it doesn't even have to be an empire in the sense that ancient empires are usually thought of and described. Secondly, I will also try to suggest that this view of imperialism that I will present will also be applicable to something we might call ecological imperialism. In this Anthropocene period, most scholars really try to think of global warming and environmental damage, negative externalities, etc., purely in terms of things that may have an industrial logic of some sort, but really are not inevitably and inextricably related to world capitalist system. If my first thesis about imperialism is right, then one could argue that the ecological imperialism defined in this sense actually is inevitable in the world capitalist system, and overcoming ecological imperialism will require a grassroots organized struggle against imperialism as such, with the recognition that ecological imperialism has become a very big part of imperialism in our times. So, let me just give a little bit of history. The roots actually go back to classical Marxism, Marx's volume 2 of Capital, where he gives the circuits of capital approach, which implicitly has been used by Marxists ever since in describing capital accumulation. The contributions of people like Lenin, Luxemburg, Bukharin, even Kautsky, in the age of classical Marxism, if we wish to call it that, essentially was to implicitly use this circuits approach and describe a process of global capital accumulation within a system of nation states in the world that had developed in the course of the development of capitalism in Europe and elsewhere, and has taken a definite form at the end of the 19th century. Of course, we are now in the 21st century. Explicit thinking about imperialism in terms of circuits approach, to my knowledge, started really in 1980s. My first paper on this was in 1985, so I worked on this between 1983 and 1985, and that paper was presented in the annual session of the Allied Social Science Association in New York in 1985. I didn't know at that time that David Harvey also in spatial terms had been developing some of these arguments and observations in his own work, and the book that he published later at the beginning of the 21st century, which is called The New Imperialism, uses explicitly a circuits approach in one of the chapters. As I said, it's implicit basically in almost all notable works by Marxists in the area of imperialism. So, without ado, let me launch into the thesis that imperialism really should be viewed as world capitalism and not simply as a kind of set of policies that are largely voluntary, and people who criticize imperialism in this kind of policy picture usually leave open the possibility, in fact, might even insist on the possibility that these policies can be changed fundamentally without changing the nature of the system. And this is something that can be contested. One scholar, one American scholar, has described this in the following way. The presence of self-legitimating ideological boundaries is evident in the discussion about empire. When writing a book about ancient Rome, this scholar discovered that much of the historic literature on empire is rather favorable. Empires have been hailed as grand accomplishments, bringing stability and peace where before there had been only squabbling tribes. We even give empires laudatory peace names such as Pax Romana or Pax Britannica. Empires also are sometimes seen as innocent, unintentional accretions that rise stochastically, that is, by chance, without benefit of any kind of conspiratorial planning or even consistent causality. Years ago, we used to hear that the British Empire was put together in a fit of absent-mindedness. This is something that you still hear repeated in some circles, and the economist describing empires wrote, and I quote, "Empires are born in funny ways, and sometimes via the law of unintended consequences by accident." Well, the thesis that I want to argue is precisely that empires are not accidental in the age of global capitalism. There is a firm and definite causal relation between the spread of capitalism, the unevenness of development of capitalism, the division of the world into the more powerful and advanced capitalist states and the less advanced ones. All these lead to imperialism inevitably in a causal sense. And Michael Parenti, the scholar I had been quoting from, also agrees. He says, in fact, empires are not innocent, absent-minded, accidental accretions. They are given purposive direction by rulers who consciously mobilize vast amounts of personnel and materials in order to plunder other lands and peoples. The British, for instance, did not just happen to find themselves in India. They pushed their way in with all deliberate force and rapacious intent. The Americans did not just mistakenly stumble into Iraq because of some misinformation that the Iraqis were linked to Al-Qaeda and possessed weapons of mass destruction. The White House coterie that pursued war had been calling for intervention against Iraq for at least a year before the 2001 attack on the World Trade Center, and well before there was ever any thought of Al-Qaeda terrorist networks in Baghdad or Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And US really is a special case in many ways, because we have to remember that the origin of these United States of America occurred through an anti-colonialist revolutionary war. And therefore, in some sense, US has always been anti-colonialist. And there is a legitimate degree of confusion, I think, one might say historically, about the role of America in terms of empire. And Parenti also agrees with this. He says, despite the sympathetic treatment accorded empires by numerous historians and others, the term empire was not comfortably applied in the United States during most of the 20th century, at least not by us Americans. Other countries had colonies, but America had, quote, territories, unquote, and possessions. So, I was taught in grade school. The word empire remains suspect, an unbecoming appellation that besmirched our shining republic. So this is really a kind of ironic situation that people, even Harvard professors, quoted by Parenti, seem to find a justification for US military power without calling or quite willing without quite willing to call it as empire. A review of Parenti's earlier book, Against Empire, in Harvard Magazine had the following words, quote, "We are militarily dominant around the world, a political unit that has overwhelming superiority of military power and uses that power to influence the behavior of other states is called an empire. Our goal is not combating a rival, but maintaining our supreme imperial position and maintaining imperial order." So this author, in spite of himself, ends up actually recognizing that there is an imperial order and we sit at the top of that order as the United States of America. And of course, right-wing pundits on television have been proclaiming that now that we are an empire, we should take the responsibility, and historians such as Niall Ferguson have used that occasion to point out that British Empire did a lot of good for the colonies, which of course remains suspect when you look at the debit side of the ledger, so to speak, of the imperial history, which is the colonial history in places like India and other colonies. If in fact British rule was so beneficial, why would the colonies in the US ever had planned to break away and follow largely protectionist and own nationalist independent policies ever since the independence? The US protectionism actually did not end till the end of the Second World War, when US was really the dominant power in the world. So in this circuit of capital approach, we focus explicitly on the underlying political economic side of imperialism, and that requires us to take a very sober look which lies behind military moves and political moves, etc. So what exactly is the way to conceptualize this? And let's go back then to classical Marxism. First of all, I must state that Marx himself never made a systematic theoretical and empirical analysis of the development of capitalism in the non-capitalist parts of the world in his time. One widely quoted remark found in the preface to the first edition of Capital has been seized by many scholars as Marx's definitive position. Here Marx says, quote, "The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future." Yet, Marx was aware of the complexities of the actual development of capitalism in specific countries. For he avers in the same preface that the backward country, quote, "suffers not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development," end of quote. A uniform law of development of capitalism in each country would be particularly attractive to a positivistic social science. But was Marx a positivist? On the basis of a particularly clear statement by Marx and other internal theoretical evidence in Marx's writing, Richard Miller of Cornell pronounces Marx to be a non-positivist. According to Miller, In the following passage, Marx emphasizes two features of his theory of history that would rule it out as unscientific if the positivist account is right. What does Marx say? He says the following, and I quote, "In several parts of Capital, I allude to the fate which overtook the plebeians of ancient Rome. They were originally free peasants, each cultivating his own piece of land on his own account. In the course of Roman history, they were expropriated. The same movement which divorced them from their means of production and subsistence involved the formation not only of big landed property, but also a big money capital. And so one fine morning, there were to be found on the one hand free men stripped of everything except their labor power, and on the other, in order to exploit this labor, those who held all the acquired wealth in their possession." What happened? The Roman proletarians became not wage laborers, but a mob of do-nothings, more abject than the former poor whites in the South of the United States. And alongside of them, there developed a mode of production which was not capitalist, but based on slavery. Thus, events strikingly analogous, but taking place in different historical surroundings, led to totally different results. By studying each of these forms of evolution separately and then comparing them, one can easily find the clue to this phenomenon, but one will never reach there by using as one's master key a general historical philosophical theory, the supreme virtue of which consists in being super-historical, end of quote. Therefore, concrete history, concrete evolution of history is extremely important in assessing what really takes place at a particular stage, not just in world capitalist system, but even in pre-capitalist societies. Furthermore, in Capital, Marx also argues that the development of capitalism, or any economic structure for that matter, may show, and I quote, "infinite variations and gradations in appearance, which can be ascertained only by an analysis of empirically given circumstances," end of quote. If Miller's interpretation of Marx's historical method and Marx's own statements are taken prima facie, then Marx's view of the development of capitalism in previously non-capitalist parts of the world after the first flowering of capital as a social relation in England must be seen as fairly complex in principle. What Marx discovered were some crucial general tendencies of the development of capitalism. However, he had no theory of imperialism in the Leninist sense. It is the task of this lecture to articulate aspects of this post-Marxian or post-Marx theory of imperialism with the help of Marx's concept of circuits of capital, and then extend this to various phenomena in today's world. Not many people nowadays read it, but Lenin's most sustained analysis of an actual society in terms of its economic and political relations was the book he published in 1899 called Development of Capitalism in Russia. And there, if one reads it, one already finds a superb analysis of capitalism in a backward country. Some dependency theorists have actually sought the authority of this book to give a Leninist flavor to their views. Cardoso is one such example. In arguing against the Narodnik's position of instant socialism in Russia, Lenin presented a two-sided argument in the development. On the one hand, he seems to take a position contrary to the Narodniks by claiming that capitalism was developing in Russia. At the same time, and largely because of this development of capitalism, the possibilities for development of proletarian politics and transition to socialism under concrete conditions were also there. This view, quite plausible within the then existent Marxist tradition, is not without a certain internal tension, however. But let's note for the moment the special features of capitalism in Russia, which Lenin had discovered. The data showed the capitalist development of Russia to be real. Nevertheless, the rate of this development was extremely slow and the extent was quite uneven. The latter feature was not surprising in itself, since the development of capitalism in Western Europe was marked by unevenness also. The tardiness of the development and the persistence of traditional, seemingly pre-capitalist forms, another discovery of Lenin, needed explanation. Here, Lenin relied on both an analysis of the internal development of class structure in Russia and the external factor of competition from Western European capitalism. The striking feature of this early analysis is the way Lenin combines the external with the internal. The capital from Western Europe accelerated the industrialization and helped the emergence of a bourgeoisie in Russia. At the same time, the weak and dependent nature of the Russian bourgeoisie, partly a result of the domination by foreign capitalists, prevented the development from being rapid and widespread. As Gabriel Palma correctly pointed out, Lenin actually gave a great deal of weight to the survival of traditional structures in Russia in his explanatory scheme. Quoting Marx's earlier remark regarding the incompleteness of capitalist development in a backward country, Lenin refers to the abundant survival of ancient institutions that are incompatible with capitalism. At the same time, Lenin notes the linkages, at least in production, between the factory and the handicraft industry, or more generally, the traditional pre-capitalist and the modern capitalist organizations of production. To summarize, Lenin in 1899 saw the development of capitalism in Russia as a slow-motion replay of the development of capitalism in Western Europe. At the same time, there is recognition of a complex interaction between the external and internal factors. The political conclusions drawn by Lenin from the development, as well as his subsequent studies, including the pamphlet Imperialism, are not to be pursued in this lecture, but I would use this to characterize our modern type of imperialism in a short while. But first, let's take a quick look at Lenin's pamphlet Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. There, he puts forth the thesis that imperialism is actually a new stage of capitalism, and there is a 5-point characterizing of this new stage. Point 1, the transformation of a primarily competitive capitalism in advanced countries to the development of monopolies with a decisive role to play in economic and political life. Now, Anwar Shaikh of New School correctly points out that Marx's idea of competition is closer to that of rivalry, and Marx also discovered the laws of concentration and centralization of capital. So this tendency of capital to accumulate in ever larger forms of organization is implicit in Marx's analysis. But what is important is the thesis that these large organizations come to play the dominant role in economic and political life in countries that are blessed with advanced capitalism. Point 2, the merger of banking capital with industrial capital and the creation of finance capital. This was actually a finding of Hilferding, who coined the term Finanzkapital or finance capital. Furthermore, this finance capital, as Marx might have put it, is personified in a financial industrial oligarchy. So we certainly can find these oligarchies in every advanced capitalist country in the world today. We don't have to look very far. But today, the financial sector is much more complicated and much more developed, one might say, in evolutionary terms than it was at that time. So it's not just banking capital, but it's also a lot of other types of financial organizations that are very important in the advanced countries. There are exceptions, like Japan and Germany, which, because of historical reason, created a bank-based system, and that bank-based system still largely survives and plays important role. But especially in the Anglo-Saxon capitalism, or even French or Italian capitalism, there are lots of other types of organizations that are important, and one could argue that even in Japan and Germany, those other financial organizations are also important. Point 3, export of capital as opposed to the previous export of commodity assumes decisive importance. This actually might lead to some form of capitalist development, at least in some sectors, in countries to which capital is exported, and we see that happening in the world, although in a very uneven way. East Asian development is probably the best one in terms of finding a part of the world where they are able to develop their own domestic varieties of capitalism under a special set of circumstances after the Second World War. But that's a complicated issue that will take us quite far afield, and therefore I will just mention it and leave it at that. Point 4, international cartels are formed which share the world economy among themselves. Of course, we have both formal cartels and informal kind of cartels. Sometimes business scholars call this global alliances or global strategic alliances, and these are very important formations. One could jump from this, as Kautsky did, and following Kautsky, people like Hard and Negri and others who follow them, they have jumped to the conclusion that the world can be just divided up peacefully. Kautsky called this ultra-imperialism, that imperialism mainly need not be a violent system of conflict among the advanced capitalist countries. But Lenin clearly disagreed with this. So the political lessons that Lenin draws about international cartels or international collaboration or collaboration among capitalists from different nation states across international borders turns out to be very different from the conclusions that Kautsky drew. And Lenin was, as one can imagine, really motivated by his quest for an explanation of the First World War and the betrayal of the cause of the working class by the social democratic parties in Europe, especially the largest social democratic party, the German Social Democratic Party, which, with the exception of a small revolutionary wing led by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, largely capitulated to their own bourgeoisie and supported the war effort, even in very chauvinistic ways. The final point, the 5th point, is that the territorial division of the whole world is completed. Only redivisions are possible from this point onwards. And uneven development of the world and uneven development of the major capitalist powers plays a big explanatory role in Lenin's argument. Because of the unevenness, the latecomers at some point, when they grow large enough, have to challenge the dominant capitalist power or the block of dominant capitalist powers. Economistic interpretations, therefore, usually miss the profound dialectics of Lenin's formulation. First of all, imperialism is a stage, a qualitatively different stage of capitalism. It leads to the formation of a new stratum among the capitalist class and a new stratum among the working class in the imperialist countries, the labor aristocracy. With sway over the economy and the state apparatus. However, a qualification in light of today's export of industrial capital as well as financial capital to the periphery must be made. Because of FDI-led creation of supply chains and the delivery of service through the use of information and communications technologies from the periphery and semi-periphery, the unskilled workers' wages in the north are either stagnant or falling in real terms. So, except for a few sellout labor union leaders, there really isn't a labor aristocracy as such. Secondly, the rise of monopolies modifies the domestic tendencies towards the falling rate of profit, but only by displacing this tendency towards the international arena. Accumulation in the age of imperialism then becomes a global process. Here too, it must be emphasized that Lenin did not depart from Marx's dialectical concept of competition, which is the rivalry of multiple capitals with tendencies towards concentration and centralization of capital. However, capitalist classes within largely antagonistic imperial nation states are still appropriators of the surplus value, and they compete globally to extract this surplus value through super exploitation of the colonial and now neo-colonial laboring masses. In this, sometimes the capitalists of different nations can cooperate. However, since the development of these capitalist economies and polities is uneven and dialectically competition and cooperation form a unity of opposites in their international behavior, there are strong tensions in the system. Given appropriate conditions, severe economic and political crisis or the development of a powerful rival, competition becomes primary and violent conflict, even world wars, may break out. Thus, imperialism is not a policy of conquest which financial capital pursues, as Bukharin and Preobrazhensky once thought, but rather a long-term, quote, policy, end of quote, that finance capital cannot avoid pursuing. Hence, it is an abuse of the word policy to use such locutions. Imperialism, economically, politically, and ideologically, is a contradictory system in motion. In this global system, the advanced capitalist countries constantly jockey for power and influence in order to dominate an ever larger part of the world. But as Lenin so succinctly put it, only a redivision is possible. Hence, the system is extremely unstable historically. With this thumbnail sketch of the key concepts and implications of Lenin's imperialism, I want to now turn to a formal way using the circuits approach. So in Capital Volume 2, Marx discusses three circuits, starting with first, the circuit of money capital. So the capitalist system as a whole, of course, is a commodity producing system. Money is very important because it is the general measure of value, of exchange value. So you start with a certain amount of money given by M subscript 1, and then different branches of capitalist production, which also, by the way, develop unevenly. They use means of production and labor power, and we'll come back to this means of production part later. And then over time, production is organized. It takes time to produce things. Therefore, these circuits are actually literally to be thought of circuits existing in real time. Then a different set of commodities will be produced. That's given by C subscript 2. And then they have to be sold. And then you will have an amount of money or total amount of production in society measured by that money, which is M2. And when the economy is growing, M2 must be greater than M1 in real terms. That is the way to talk about economic growth in an exchange value-based capitalist society. But there are breakdown possibilities everywhere in this. First, to organize the production, you have to create markets for means of production and for labor power, and we'll come back to that again. And then to produce, you have to organize workers in factory systems or other kinds of systems. And modern technologies both create possibilities of organizing labor across national borders, but also present problems of various sorts as well. And then finally, selling these commodities would present a problem, and both Malthus and Keynes actually understood this part. So in a sense, Malthus was the first political economist who realized the question of aggregate demand, and Keynes justly gives him credit in his book as a pioneer in this thinking. But he ignores Marx, but this circuit makes it clear that the Keynesian economics is actually at the end of this circuit, this money circuit. Productive capital is when we start with the production process and go forward and end up with another production process. So this is the way capitalism becomes diverse as it grows. And finally, we have another circuit that is based on commodities. Now, in the age of imperialism, all these circuits are international, and you can analyze most things like commodity chains, for example, by focusing on, say, commodity capital circuit or productive capital circuit. The finance capital aspect can be organized meaningfully by looking at these three circuits, and in addition adding things to the monetary circuit, because the financial sector grows and becomes so complex, and in many countries really overtakes all other sectors. This acquires a special importance, and all are familiar with the term globalization, but basically globalization is a specific form of imperialism in this type of theoretical approach. And that kind of approach has the benefit that it shows us the contradictions and tensions of globalization, if we care to think about them. And people who took this approach very early on could point out the possible developments of contradictions in the system, and therefore to such scholars, the anti-globalization movement would not have been a surprise. Here I should mention that Polanyi insightfully also introduced the idea of double movement, the attempt to create markets and the backlash by people who are affected negatively by these market developments to fight back. And he identified specifically certain areas like money and land and labor that presented special problems. Finance capital has the advantage that it can be moved around quite easily. Even foreign direct investment can be moved around quite easily in this day and age. And that means that there are vulnerabilities on the dominated side that are much greater than on the dominant side, except when two things happen. One is that competition among the rivals, these rival nation states, grows so intense that they cannot really cooperate and cannot any longer exploit the dominated countries together. So it's a good question whether institutions like IMF and World Trade Organization and World Bank, some branches of the United Nations, and other specific international organizations set up basically to serve global capitalism and its dominant partners. You can basically talk about the G7, but probably even there, only a few are dominant. In any case, these modes of cooperation that exist today are not eternal and might break down if the stresses of competition among these rivals become primary and dominant factor in world economy and world politics. This is precisely what happened during the 1930s in much of the world. The second factor is the organized resistance from below. We always have sporadic and somewhat spontaneous resistances, but there are times when working people learn that, usually through bitter experiences, they learn that they have to act together. They have to form agendas that make sense, even as reform agendas. And some of them, of course, think beyond the reform agendas and want to go beyond capitalism. So this kind of movement becomes very scary for the capitalist class, and counter tendencies towards fascism also develop. And it's a very lucky country that can resist those pressures. And in that sense, the achievements of the United States in the 1930s or United Kingdom in the 1930s were not trivial. Although the leaders there definitely wanted to save capitalism, they also wanted to fight against fascism. Not always in a very determined way, at least not until the Second World War itself broke out. So it's a complicated political process, and you cannot do without real concrete historical analysis. But the theoretical framework itself points to that kind of historical analysis, and that is the strength of this kind of approach, I would argue. And I'd argue finally that consistent with the world systems theory, which is an important theory, over time, the export of capital to non-imperialist countries can result in some of these peripheral countries to become semi-peripheral. This happened historically to late industrializers. More recently, the East Asian economies, including China, have followed this path. And some of us have been studying this for quite some time. So let me just make clear the term I'm going to use for circuits of capital. I will call them International Circuits of Capital, or ICC. And the question then becomes, how can we build a theory of ICC which can then serve as a foundation for a theory, among other things, of ecological imperialism, for example. When we think about it, we notice that all the export of capital, even when it is in the form of means of production, has to be in the form of some form of money capital, broadening money to include a lot of finance. This is true because the receiving country must either have credit or pay for the capital received out of its own foreign currency reserves. In the first case, the credit advanced will ensure a flow of foreign exchange to the receiving country, which will promptly reverse the flow by its obligation to pay for the purchase. So money capital is advanced, even though it is borrowed, by the receiving country through its credit. In the second case, money capital is advanced directly by the receiving country. It is important to note that without the receipt of the money capital, it would be impossible to begin a genuine regime of capital accumulation. That is to say, where you start with a sum of money capital and then augment it at the end of the cycle. The next step is the use of money capital as productive capital in different parts of the world. Here, within the closed domestic economy model, Marx was careful to point out both the logical and historical importance of this step. But in the age of global capitalism and imperialism, including ecological imperialism, the extension of this step to global productions and global commodity chains is a fundamental theoretical move. And there, the transformation of money capital into productive capital is to be analyzed in all its complexity and all its forms. And one of them is the exploitation of nature, to really make nature into a commodity. And we have seen these moves in action for the last 150 or more years, but they have especially accelerated with the so-called globalization during the 1980s and from then on. So what is necessary for the development of the productive circuit of capital is the existence of markets for labor power and of production facilities to combine this with the means of production. It is also important to know that without this move, logically and historically, money cannot really qualify as capital either. History here compels logic. Unless in reality a class of expropriated, propertyless workers confronts a class of moneyed entrepreneurs, the circuit can hardly begin. In the Marxist conception of history, this can only be the result of historically specific and contextual class struggles involving the coercive powers of a bourgeois state in formation, and in the process continuously generates further class struggle even as the state consolidates its hold and helps create labor and capital markets in particular. And this is what is really going on in the peripheral countries today. And along with it, we are noticing, of course, increased urbanization, increased congestion, lack of proper infrastructure, pollution that basically hits you between the eyes and in the nose, and crises that no longer can be ignored because they do hit you between the eyes, so to speak. So we have to at least sketch out a kind of complex class relation and position, and simply we can ignore the semi-peripheries for the moment and focus on the imperialist countries and dominated countries. And in a two-country model, just for simplicity, imperialist country will have at least the following differentiations. First, you will have the monopoly capitalists in various sectors, then the other capitalists who are largely dominated by the monopoly capitalists. The life of a small businessman anywhere in the world is not an easy one. And then you might have a small group of labor aristocrats. As I said, today it's actually a very tiny amount in all the advanced countries, but they do exist. And they essentially are sellouts in terms of workers' struggles. But we do have a differentiated working class according to wage, race, ethnicity, gender, and of course we have classical petty bourgeois as well. In the dominated country, we have the export-import capitalists, we have the productive capitalists who are not always in evidence, but in East Asia certainly, through a set of historical circumstances, a class of productive capitalists did emerge at a crucial point in time. Also, there are landlords and a differentiated peasantry according to land holdings, race, ethnicity, etc., plus landless peasants. We have also urban proletariat, who are also differentiated because of the investment in the export-import sectors by usually foreign companies and also the foreign aid establishment. Petty commodity producers are also very important, something that is called informal sector quite often. Semi-peripheral countries, which we did ignore a moment ago, have a dual character. They are dominated in crucial technological and financial aspects by the imperialist countries, and thus are forced to transfer ecological resources through free trade. At the same time, they are able to dominate to various degrees the peripheral economies. So it can be argued that this is the status of countries like China today, and India possibly, and Brazil. So here I cannot develop this political aspect further, and perhaps I should just emphasize that in East Asia, one crucial internal problem related to the circuit of productive capital in terms of the development of capitalist agriculture. The nature of land reform associated with this has not always been cosmetic, and precisely those countries which opened up the avenues for a capitalist agriculture, such as Korea, Taiwan, etc., are the ones that were developing the fastest in the last quarter of the 20th century. The problem of what happens in any one country in terms of economic policies is therefore a function of both the international context and the class struggles within the nation. In the economic development of these countries, the following factors are relevant. First, the initial level of development of productive forces. Second, indigenous class formation. Third, linkages with the international finance capital. And fourth, internal class struggles as they link up with the policies of international financial or finance capital. So there are contradictions, however, if we look at this process dialectically, and I will just identify 4 of them for the moment, leading to a kind of semi-resolution. First, contradictions in the accumulation process in the form of competition and cooperation between the imperialist nations moves towards technological fix, class struggles and compromises, as well as possible conflicts not resolvable through negotiations. And a complex global ecological politics is emerging precisely in these contexts. Second, contradictions in the accumulation process in the form of domination of the less developed countries and struggles against imperialism. Complex global coalition formation, treaties, interventions, regional wars, etc. Third, the contradictions between capital and nature under this uneven development of global capital and class struggles. The impossibility of solving this contradiction globally under the world capitalist systems, economics, and politics ultimately. And finally, resolution of these contradictions through a people-centered politics and a democratic internationalism from below. An analysis of these features in the context of the dialectics of global accumulation process, I submit, will reveal not only the central role that imperialism, including ecological imperialism, plays in the world economy today, but also the complex network of relationships among classes and within and outside the borders of any particular nation state. Ultimately, this will help determine the contours of the tumultuous events such as global prosperity or depression, development or underdevelopment, war or peace. And eventually, it will determine the possibilities of transition to deeply democratic forms of local and global governance. Alternatively, it may also mean transition to forms of state capitalism for both the advanced and the developing countries. Therefore, research on imperialism, including ecological imperialism, should receive serious attention from both radical scholars and political activists of the 21st century. I don't want to go into this. I have a paper in which I discuss more the political aspects of fighting against ecological imperialism and the international dimensions of the problem. But I will conclude simply by saying that according to the argument that I presented, imperialism is a structural phenomenon in world capitalist system. But this structural phenomenon really has complex manifestations and complex causal interrelations. Therefore, one cannot draw simplistic conclusions one way or another. A lot depends on class struggles of various sorts and other movements, including ecological movements that sometimes have broad interclass coalitions as well. And ultimately, the concrete political aspects must be analyzed concretely and politically. Thank you.